Welcome back to the Psyche and Singularity series. I've been going over my book, Psyche and Singularity, Jungian Psychology, and Holographic String Theory. In this video, I will be comparing this fusion of Jung's cosmology and psychology with Leonard Susskind's holographic string theory cosmology. I'll be comparing that fusion to St. Augustine's cosmology, specifically as he presents it in his famous book, The Confessions of St. Augustine. I will start off by reading from the cultural historian Richard Tarnas. In his great book, The Passion of the Western Mind, he writes, "It was Augustine's formulation of Christian Platonism that was to permeate virtually all of medieval Christian thought in the West." So, St. Augustine is famous for interpreting the Bible through primarily the lens of Plato's philosophy. Now, in the previous two videos, I was comparing this string theory cosmology fusion with Jungian psychology to Plato's cosmology, specifically as presented in the Timaeus and the Republic. And the biggest parallel is Plato's description of the horizon of the cosmos as this mother and receptacle of all created things that somehow partakes in the intelligible world of eternal forms. So that is very similar to Carl Jung's near-death experience, where he said he experienced the past, the present, and the future at the horizon of the cosmos, from which he believed this illusion of three-dimensional space is projected by these threads. Each of us is in our own little cube of space tethered to the horizon of the cosmos by a thread. So that's the big parallel upon which my book, Psyche and Singularity, is based. In his Confessions, St. Augustine describes this horizon of the cosmos in a way that's very similar to Jung's description and to Leonard Suskind's. But I want to start by going over, in Plato's Republic, he talked about the curriculum for the ideal rulers of the ideal society. And the mathematical curriculum starts off with a study of just the dimensionless numbers, adding up, learning the basics, the ABCs, the 1, 2, 3s of math. And then it goes to addition and subtraction, multiplication, which can be seen as a number line, a one-dimensional number line, adding and subtracting, greater or lesser. Then it moves on to two-dimensional geometry of surfaces, plane geometry. Then it moves to the three-dimensional geometry of solids, which was not well developed at the time, Plato points out, or he has Socrates point out in the Republic. And then it culminates with a study of astronomy and music, which study the movement of three-dimensional objects, it's the study of the fourth dimension of time. And now Socrates says if you can study those four levels of nature and then understand how they're all related to each other, then you can prepare yourself to open the eye of the soul to the idea of the good, which we talked about and which I compared to the gravitational singularity. So, Augustine follows that advice, at least culminating with the study of time in the Confessions. And I'm going to start in Book 11 of Confessions, where he prays to God, "Grant me to hear and understand what is meant by, in the beginning you made heaven and earth." So that's the first book of the Bible. It's the first verse of Genesis. Augustine's praying to God, let me know what you mean by that. He says, "For so Moses wrote and went his way, passed from this world to you, and is no longer here before me." So he doesn't understand clearly, or he's begging God to help him understand what is meant by that first verse of the Bible. Now I'm going to read that beginning lines of the Bible so that you can have a framework within which to understand Augustine's questions to God, because he differentiates the heaven and earth that are created in the first verse from the the heaven and earth that are created in subsequent verses. So here's just a translation of Genesis. It reads, "In the beginning, God created heaven and earth." That's the phrase that Augustine's going to be focusing on. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. And the earth was void and empty, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved over the waters. And God said, "Be light made," and light was made. And God saw that light, and God saw the light that it was good, and he divided the light from the darkness, and he called the light day, and the darkness night, and there was evening and morning, one day. So notice, that's the first day where God divided the light, the day from the night. But in the beginning, God created heaven and earth. There's no numbered day given to that phrase. This is something Augustine's going to make a point of. In the beginning, he's going to say, it wasn't the heaven, the stars that we see above us that the Bible's referring to. And when God said, in the beginning, God created heaven and earth, the earth wasn't planet Earth that we stand on. The earth, Augustine will interpret that earth to be this formless matter, the potential being that's almost nothing. God from nothing created this almost nothing, which is called earth in the first verse of the Bible. And then from that almost nothing, that formless matter, he created all of the rest of the material things we can see. So in the beginning, God created heaven and earth. The heaven, Augustine will say, doesn't refer to the visible heaven, but what he'll go on to call the heaven of heaven. So I'll get to there, but I just want to get a taste of where he's going with this and show how it is carrying on the Platonic tradition of studying these rising dimensions of nature, culminating with the dimension of time, in order to open the eye of the soul to the idea of the good, and that is what Augustine is trying to do. So then he goes on to ask, in section 5 of book 11, "But how did you make heaven and earth? What instrument did you use for a work so mighty?" So he'll say, but there was no bodily thing before heaven and earth. He goes on to say in book 11, so there was no physical instruments you could have used to create the earth, like a smith creating a horseshoe or something like that. So what instrument did you use to create the heaven and earth? He'll say in book 11 of chapter 7, "Clearly you are calling us to the realization of that word, God with you, God as you are God, which is uttered eternally, and by which all things are uttered eternally." The Word, he's referring there to Jesus. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. That's the first verse from the Gospel according to John. So, in the beginning was the Word. Jesus is the Word. So then Augustine's going to say, oh, that means the first verse of Genesis, in the beginning, God created heaven and earth. That means God created this primordial, formless earth and the heaven of heaven in Jesus, the personified beginning. That's how he's going to interpret that. So it gets a little complex, but I think it makes more sense when we compare it to Timaeus's cosmology and the cosmology of the Republic. And especially, I think it makes more sense when we see it in light of Susskind's holographic string theory cosmology of the horizon of the cosmos. So, Jesus is the Word, the Logos, the eternal rational principle of God's mind. He'll go on to say, Augustine will, on chapter 8, book 11, "Tell me, O Lord my God, how this can be. In a kind of way I see, but how to express it I do not know, save that whatever comes into being and ceases to be begins at that moment and ends at that moment when the eternal reason," and that's Jesus, "which has in itself no beginning or ending, knows that it should begin or end. The eternal reason is your Word, the beginning, who also speaks unto us. This he tells us in the gospel to our bodily ear. This he uttered exteriorly in the ears of men, that we might believe in him and seek him within us and find him in the eternal truth, where the one good master teaches all his disciples." So he'll go on to say, this then, O God, was the beginning in which you created heaven and earth, marvelously speaking and marvelously creating in your Word, who is your Son and your strength and your wisdom and your truth. So In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. Within Jesus, God created this heaven of heaven, which he'll then go on to call an intellectual heaven that is co-eternal. It's not co-eternal with God and Jesus and the Holy Spirit, and yet it is immortal. It was created at a point in, not even in time. It was created by God before time, and it never ages. He'll go on to explain. It's very similar to the way Plato has the Pythagorean astronomer Timaeus describe the horizon of the cosmos. So I'm just going to read here a little bit more from Augustine. He goes in Book 11 still, in chapter 14, he says a famous phrase here I've heard other people quote it before. Michio Kaku quoted this. What is this time? If no one asks me, I know. If I want to explain it to a questioner, I do not know. So what is time? Plato had Socrates say, that's the final study. What is time? To prepare you for the vision of the idea of the good. So Augustine here, in his Confessions, he's asking God, what is time? He says, I really don't know. He goes on to implore God, my mind burns to solve this complicated enigma. O Lord my God, O good Father, for Christ's sake, I beseech thee, do not shut off these obscure familiar problems from my longing. Do not shut them off and leave them impenetrable, but let them shine clear for me in the light of thy mercy, O Lord. So he is seriously begging God to teach him about the nature of time, and specifically the creation of the universe in the beginning. What is the beginning? That is Jesus Christ himself. We're going to see ultimately that Augustine will pray to God to be reunited with God and transfigured in this heaven of heaven, which can easily be equated with the horizon of the cosmos. So in Book 11 still, chapter 25, he says, I confess to you, Lord, that I still do not know what time is. All right, so we'll move on now to Book 12. And chapter 2, he says, but where, O Lord, is the heaven, of which we have heard in the voice of the psalm? The heaven of heaven is the Lord's, but the earth he has given to the children of men. So that is a quote throughout the Confessions. He italicizes quoted verses from the Bible, and that particular one, which is the one that's most important for this meditation on the horizon of the cosmos, it's from Psalm 113, verse 24. It says, the heaven of heaven is the Lord's, but the earth he has given to the children of men. So that heaven of heaven referred to in the Psalms is what Augustine will equate the heaven of the first verse of Genesis. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. Augustine's going to say, in the beginning is Jesus, and the heaven referred to there is the heaven of heaven, which appeared in Psalms 113, verse 24. So Augustine goes on to say, where is that heaven which we do not see, by comparison with which all that we do see is but earth? He goes on to say, compared to that heaven of heaven, the heaven above our earth is but earth. So he's differentiating the heaven of heaven from the visible sky, the stars. In comparison, that visible world is really, it's material. It's like earth. So then he's going to meditate on the formlessness referred to in that first verse of Genesis. In Book 12, chapter 4, he says, what can we call that formlessness? How convey it to men's sluggish minds? And in chapter 6, in the middle of chapter 6, he says, but I could not do it. I should have found it easier to think that whatever is totally without form cannot exist at all, than to conceive something between form and non-being, lacking form, yet not nothing, formless and almost nothing. Later in that same chapter 6, he says, for the mutability of mutable things is simply their capacity for all the forms into which mutable things can be changed. But what is this? Is it soul? Is it body? Is it any species of soul or body? If it were allowable to say that it is a nothing, which is in some way something, or that it is and yet is not, that is what I should say. So that is the formless earth he's referring to. It is something, but it's almost nothing. and it's related to this heaven of heaven. Before moving on, I want to read that section from the Timaeus. So going back to Plato's Timaeus, he describes God creating a spherical universe. He put the soul in the center, which also encompasses the spherical border. And then he brings up, and he calls it this horizon of the cosmos, he calls it this mother and receptacle of all created and visible and in any way sensible things, an invisible and formless being which receives all things and in some mysterious way partakes of the intelligible and is most incomprehensible. So that verse seems to me to be a big source for Augustine's description of the horizon of the cosmos, which he also calls our mother. And he'll describe the eternality of this mother as coming from her pure love for God who dwells in each point of her. Similarly, the gravitational singularity exists at each point of the cosmic horizon, where the past, the present, and the future coexist. So I'm trying to show how, following Plato's academic procedure laid out in the Republic, Leonard Susskind accidentally returned to the Platonic cosmology within which the original curriculum was presented, and that St. Augustine describes the same cosmology influenced by Plato and interpreting the Bible through that Platonic cosmology, and that the cosmology Augustine is describing here that we're going over was the worldview of the Western European world for over 1,000 years. And then it fell with Copernicus and a new cosmology, but what I'm arguing is that the synthesis of Jung and Susskind that I've been describing brings us back to this Augustinian medieval Christian cosmology. It's much more similar to that, and that this is the beginning of another 1,000 years or another age of truer enlightenment of the archetypal source of light itself, which Plato called the idea of the good, which Augustine calls God, and I'm saying that is revealed in the realm of mathematical physics as the gravitational singularity. So when I'm describing Augustine's descriptions of this mother of the universe, and the spouse of the Logos, the spouse of God, we should keep in mind it's rooted in Plato's Timaeus. And so I'm going to continue to read from the Timaeus, where he describes between the two realms of the eternal forms and the temporary forms, there's a third nature, he says, which is space and is eternal and admits not of destruction and provides a home for all created things, and is apprehended when all sense is absent by a kind of spurious reason, and is hardly real, which we, beholding as in a dream, say of all existence that it must of necessity be in some place and occupy a space, but that what is neither in heaven nor in earth has no existence. All right, so this third nature, this home for all created things, is the receiving vessel, the mother and receptacle, the horizon of the cosmos, which is described alternately as partaking in the eternal realm of the intelligible, this third nature, which is formless, and yet at the same time gives birth to all the forms of nature and receives them all within her. So, with that review of the Timaeus, I'm going to continue here in the Confessions. When in the Genesis, when Moses said, in the beginning God created heaven and earth, he didn't say on the first or the second or the third day. He says in the beginning, in this numberless beginning. So Augustine writes, I assume that it is because, why did he say the beginning and not give it a numbered day? I assume that it is because by heaven is meant heaven of heaven, the intellectual heaven, where it is given to the intellect to know in one act, and not part by part, not to know now one thing, now another, but, as has been said, to know in one act without any succession of time. So, that is a big parallel with Jung's description of the horizon of the cosmos, and Leonard Suskind's. The past, the present, and the future exist at each point in this encompassing horizon from which the material world is projected. Augustine doesn't talk about the threads that project inward from the horizon of the cosmos, but he does say it's this heaven of heaven is an intellectual being. Now, he's thinking in a Platonic context. For Plato, the idea of the good, as we discussed in the cave allegory, the ultimate archetype from which all other archetypes radiate, is the idea of the good, the spiritual sun. The visible sun is a shadow of the invisible but intelligible eternal idea of the good, the spiritual sun. And just like all the material forms radiate from the sun, according to Plato's cosmology in the Republic, so do all the eternal forms radiate from the idea of the good. Now, all of those ideas are incarnate in the Logos, the Word, or Jesus Christ. He's the walking incarnation of all of the ideas of God's mind. So that's how Augustine interprets the idea of the good, and which contains all of the other ideas. In God's mind are all of the absolute ideas from which the material world is created. For Plato's cosmology, every object or concept that you can think of is rooted in some eternal form or absolute idea. So if you see a visible tree, they're all reflections of or projections of the absolute idea of tree. And for Augustine, it's the idea of a tree that God has in his mind, and then he creates all of the visible trees, which are imperfect reflections of that absolute idea. And all of those absolute ideas are personified in Jesus Christ. And finally, Jesus' home is with his mother, the spouse of God, at the horizon of the cosmos, which Augustine calls the heaven of heaven, this intellectual being. So, like Plato had Timaeus describe the horizon of the cosmos as a mother and receptacle of all created, invisible, and in any way sensible things, Augustine says, there was then a created wisdom, created before all things. The reasonable and intellectual mind of your pure city, our mother, which is above and is free and eternal in heaven. So, she contains all of the ideas of God's mind because she contains Jesus Christ, the Logos, who's the personified mind of God. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit in Christian theology are one person, and that one person is dwelling in every part of this encompassing heaven of heaven. Chapter 11 in book 12 of the Confessions, again, you said with a strong voice in the ear of my spirit. So this is Augustine talking to God, and he's saying, you explain this to me in the spiritual ear, that creature, the heaven of heaven, is not co-eternal with you. You are its sole delight, and it tastes of your delight in purity unfailing. Never and in no way does it lose its quality of mutability, yet, being ever in your presence and held to you with utter love, having no future in anticipation, nor passing away into any past for memory, it suffers no variation, and its being is not spread out over time. Happy creature, if such there be, because it inheres in your beatitude, with you ever indwelling and illuminating it. I find nothing which would seem to me more worthy to be called the heaven of heaven, which is the Lord's, than such a dwelling place of yourself, which ever contemplates your delight, without ever falling away from your contemplation upon lesser things, a pure mind united in perfect harmony, in a binding union of peace, with those holy spirits, the citizens of your city, which is in heaven, far above the heavens we see. So in addition to calling this horizon of the cosmos our mother and the spouse of God, he also calls it the city of God and Jerusalem. And he yearns to be reunited with God in that city, the house of God, which is his interpretation of the horizon of the cosmos that Timaeus described in Plato's dialogue by that name. So I'm going to continue here in Book 12 in chapter 13. And he'll say, I observe that Scripture does not say on what day you made these things. In the beginning, God made heaven and earth. So not a day, just in this more generic term, the beginning, which again is, he's interpreting that to mean Jesus, the Logos. So I observe that Scripture does not say on what day you made these things. I assume that it is because by heaven is meant the heaven of heaven, the intellectual heaven, where it is given to the intellect to know in one act, and not part by part, not in a dark manner, not through a glass, but wholly in full sight, face to face, not to know now one thing, now another, but, as has been said, to know in one act without any succession of time. So again, all of the knowledge of the past, the present, and the future is known simultaneously in one act at this horizon of the cosmos, this heaven of heaven, this spouse of God. So then on chapter 15, he'll go on to say, he's now talking hypothetically to people who might reject his interpretation of Genesis. He says, perhaps you deny that there exists a sublime creature, cohering to the true and truly eternal God with love so pure that, though not co-eternal with him, yet it does not detach itself and flow away from him into any variation or vicissitude of time. This is the house of God, not an earthly house, nor of any material heaven, but spiritual, a sharer of your eternity, because for eternity it remains without sin. Yet it was not co-eternal with you, for it is not without beginning. It too was made. So it never changes and it never will cease to exist, but it did come into being. When? Not in any temporal moment of time, because it came to existence before time, so it was created in the beginning. So continuing here, Book 12, Chapter 15, certainly we do not find any time before it, for wisdom has been created before all things. Of course, I do not mean that wisdom, with a capital W, who is co-eternal and equal, O our God, with you, his Father, and by whom all things were created, the beginning, he's talking about Jesus, in whom you made heaven and earth. So the wisdom with a capital W is Jesus, and the wisdom with a small w is the horizon of the cosmos. I refer to created wisdom, that intellectual nature, which by the contemplation of light is light itself. I'm skipping a little in this same chapter 15. There was then a certain created wisdom, created before all things, the reasonable and intellectual mind of your pure city, our mother, which is above and is free and eternal in heaven. We do not find any time before it, because it precedes the creation of time, being created before all things. Yet before it lies the eternity of its creator. So I'll read this important quote again. There was then a certain created wisdom, created before all things, the reasonable and intellectual mind of your pure city, our mother, which is above and is free and eternal in heaven. So that is the intellectual mind of the city of God. It's our mother, just like in the Timaeus. The horizon of the cosmos is our mother. So, well, now he's going to pray to be reunited with God, specifically within our mother, the city of God, the horizon of the cosmos, the heaven of heavens. So I'll continue here in chapter 15. He says, yet we not only find no time before it, we find no time in it, because it is fitted to gaze always upon your face, nor ever to be turned away, so that it is subjected to no change, but mutability abides in its essence, so that it could fall into darkness and coldness, unless it cohered to you in a love so great that your noonday ever shone upon it and warmed it with its heat. That's similar to the way the gravitational singularity is contained in each point of the encompassing horizon of the cosmos, rendering it thereby an eternal memory bank of the universe, which is very similar to what Augustine's describing here. So continuing, he says, O lovely and luminous house, I have loved your beauty in the place where the glory dwells of my Lord, who made it and possesses it. In my pilgrimage may I sigh for you, and I ask of him who made you, that he should possess me too in you, because me too he made. I have gone astray like a sheep that is lost, but I hope that I may be brought back to you upon the shoulders of my shepherd, your builder. You whom I answer as my opponents, what have you to say to me? You believe that Moses was a pious servant of God, and his books, oracles of the Holy Spirit. Is not that the house of God, not indeed co-eternal with God, yet in its own mode eternal in heaven, where you look in vain for the changes of time, because you will not find them? It rises beyond all extension and all fleeting space of time, for its good is to adhere to God forever. So he's praying to be reunited with God in this city of God, which doesn't have extension in space. It doesn't suffer the vicissitudes of time. And these are all also descriptions of a holographic horizon of the cosmos described by Susskind and 't Hooft's string theory. So continuing now in Book 12, Chapter 16, St. Augustine says, "Let me enter into my chamber and sing my songs of love to thee, groaning with inexpressible groaning in my pilgrimage and remembering Jerusalem with my heart, stretching upwards and longing for it. Jerusalem, my fatherland, Jerusalem, which is my mother, and remember thee, its ruler, its light, its father and tutor and spouse, its pure and strong delight, its joy unshakable, and the sum of all ineffable good, because thou alone art the one supreme and true good. So that I shall not turn away, but shall come to the peace of that Jerusalem, my dear mother, where are the first fruits of my spirit, from which all certitude comes to me, and there thou shalt collect from my present scatteredness and deformity all that I am, and thou shalt reform me and confirm me unto eternity, O my God, my mercy." So that is pretty heavy stuff. It's reminiscent of his conversion experience in the garden, where he heard a child speak out, "Tole lege," pick up and read, pick up and read. I talk about that. It's one of the most famous instances of synchronicity or meaningful coincidences, but you can see here in that same book, near the end, with the same kind of intensity that he threw himself on the ground under the fig tree, begging God to free him from the shackles of lust. He's begging God to reunite his scattered fragments and deformities into a transfigured whole, specifically in the city of God, the Jerusalem, our mother and spouse, this eternal horizon of the cosmos. So that Augustinian worldview framed the worldview of people for 1,000 years throughout European history. And we can see it now reemerging, I'm saying, with the synthesis of Jung and Leonard Susskind. So I do want to read, before I end this video on the parallels of Augustine and this Jungian Susskind synthesis, I want to read from another book of Richard Tarnas's, Cosmos and Psyche, Intimations of a New Worldview, where he discusses the paradigm of astrology, the archetypal meanings of the planets. But all I want to say for now, I do deal with that later in the book, but for now I just want to read from page 265. And he says, "As regards the long historical evolution of the Western psyche and spirit, these two paradigmatic figures, Jung and Augustine, were born with nearly identical configurations of the three planets we have been studying, which is Saturn, Pluto, and Uranus. And in their lives and thought, they worked with highly similar archetypal dynamics and tensions." So Richard Tarnas sees this parallel between Jung and Augustine, which I think is fitting, because they both had, Jung specifically said he went to the horizon of the cosmos after he had a heart attack in 1944, and he experienced directly the very things that Augustine is understanding. He's saying through the ear of his spirit, he's praying to God, tell me, what is time? What is the beginning? What does it mean that in the beginning God created heaven and earth? What is that heaven? What is that earth? And he comes to this conclusion of the city of God, this new Jerusalem, this horizon of the cosmos, the spouse of God, which is so very similar to Jung's experience of the cosmic horizon, so that it does seem as if we are coming back to the same cosmology that Plato described and that Augustine made the foundational worldview of the Western mind. So in the next video, I'm going to discuss how the Augustinian Platonic cosmology culminated with Dante, after which it collapsed in the wake of Copernicus, and how philosophers, beginning with René Descartes, tried to reestablish an understanding of God and the soul that was not attached necessarily to this Platonic cosmology. And then I'll show how David Hume rejected Descartes' attempt to reestablish this idea of God and the soul, and then how Immanuel Kant responded to Hume in a way that paved the way for Carl Jung's theory of the collective unconscious mind. So that will be in the next video.